What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right. So I know that most people, when asked who is the greatest in-game dunker, well, before I get to that, most people, if you asked them who is the greatest dunker of all time, I think most people now would say Vince Carter. Some might say Julius Erving. Some who grew up in the 80s and 90s might even still say Dominique Wilkins. Okay. Maybe a small minority might say Jordan. But usually, when it comes to this category, people are generally honest in their assessment. And when you consider that ever since they've been tracking the dunk stat, I believe only Kobe Bryant and I think Vince are the only guards, I should say, excuse me, to have over 1,000 dunks in their career. Now, that stat's a little old, so maybe Wade might have joined it. I'm not sure about that. But I know at one point in time they're the only two to have 1,000 dunks. Now, mind you, they only started tracking that stat in the late 90s. So I'm pretty sure Dominique Wilkins, even though he was a three, I'm pretty sure Jordan was close to that at least. Probably at least 800, 900, I would say close. But anyway, I think sometimes there are some guys who are unsung. There are some guys who don't get mentioned in these conversations because of two reasons: generational bias and, unfortunately, a lack of exposure as far as games, highlights, etc. So when you combine the lack of actual visual evidence, and coupled with the fact that these guys played some of them almost 40 years ago, well then it's going to lead to people saying, "Oh, that's BS," blah blah blah, whatever. David Thompson, to anybody that watched him, should be in that conversation at least amongst the great dunkers of all time, in particular in-game dunkers. Now, he was at a disadvantage for a couple of reasons. Number one, he grew up in rural North Carolina. So, look, that's not exactly New York. That's not exactly a large media market. And even in those days, I know they didn't really have the constant 24/7 coverage that they have today. That they have it back then. But still, if you came from New York, you got more media coverage. If you came from Philly, you probably got more media coverage. Even if you came from LA, especially I would say by the late 70s onward, you got more coverage. Not so much North Carolina per se. Now, North Carolina is a big college city, college state. And, um, so David Thompson was a local legend there in local affiliates, but nationally, not really. Also, David Thompson was at a disadvantage because of an NCAA rule at that time, which was lifted ironically, or I shouldn't say ironically, but unfortunately for him, after he left college. And that was at the time that he played, the dunk was outlawed. I think it was from 1967 to about 1975 or so, I want to say. The dunk was, or 74 or 75, one of the two. The dunk was outlawed. They thought it was a competitive advantage that was too great for centers. As you remember, if you look at highlights in the 50s and 60s, these guys rarely dunked. And that was because back then it was frowned upon. It was looked upon as showing up your opponent. It was looked upon as being not it was looked upon as a maneuver that was, man, I got to be careful how I say this. It was looked upon as a maneuver that was A, unbecoming of basketball, and B, ghettoish. You got to read between lines when I'm saying that. Okay, I don't believe that, but that's what some of them believe. You know what? You got to read between the lines when I say that. Okay. So Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the greatest high school and, in my opinion, collegiate player of all time, immediately after he declared for UCLA, I think it was mere days, the NCAA leadership committee, they voted overwhelmingly to outlaw the dunk. So that's why you don't see any highlights of Kareem dunking. And if you did dunk, initially the penalty was you would lose the 2 points and lose possession. Then a couple of years later on, after that, the penalty was a technical foul. So David Thompson never dunked in his collegiate career, not because he couldn't, but because he couldn't. You know what I mean? He didn't dunk until his last game. He got permission. I think he told his coach he was going to do it. And he dunked, and it was a rim rattler. I mean, he jumped over a guy in his last dunk. Got a technical foul. Coach took him out. It is what it is. This is the thing, as far as why I think David Thompson is one of the game's greatest in-game dunkers. Gotta remember, man, that he didn't have some of the physical gifts aside from insane leaping ability, which was, he was verified. You know, sometimes we guesstimate a guy had a vertical leap this high, that high. David Thompson had a 44-inch vertical leap that was verified. To put that in comparison, Julius Erving had a 41-inch vertical leap. He was about 6'7". Vince Carter had a 43-inch vertical leap in his prime. I think he was about 6'6". Kobe Bryant had a 38-inch vertical leap. And some people might be a little shocked by that. Like, that's still much higher than normal because the average vertical leap was around 28 inches. So he had a 38-inch vertical leap. He was 6'5" and a half, 6, whatever. Jordan in his prime had a 47 to 48-inch vertical leap. When he came back from retirement the first time, his vertical leap was probably around 40, 41. When he came up with the Wizards, it was way down. It was probably him putting on all that weight and then getting back in shape plus age. It really took away a lot of his athleticism. His vertical leap probably was in the low 30s by then. But David Thompson had a 44-inch vertical leap. He couldn't palm the basketball, so he had to cup the ball when he did certain things. But the fact that he was only 6'4" and was able to do the things that he did. I mean, people are awed by the things that Dwayne Wade did, but he was no David Thompson. I mean, David Thompson jumped over big men. And we all know when a little guy does things as far as dunking, it just looks more impressive because of the height disparity. You know what I'm saying? Like, don't get me wrong, Larry Nance and, you know, some of these bigger guys that dunk, they do some great things, but it just looks aesthetically just much more impressive when a little guy's doing it. So the first time people really got to see David Thompson was in the 1976 ABA All-Star game. And he contended against Julius Erving. He contended against, I think, Artis Gilmore, George Gervin, who could throw it down. And it was at Denver. So he was a home court favorite, but Julius Erving won it with the free throw line dunk, which at that time had never been seen before. So Julius Erving deserved it, but David Thompson put on the show as well. Absolutely, man. But David Thompson, the first couple of years that he played before the drugs and injuries, drug usage and injuries took a toll on him. Anybody that watched him, especially that year when he averaged 27.2 points per game, just slightly, just a smidget behind George Gervin for the scoring title, 77-78 season, when he scored a remarkable 73 points, including 53 in the first half. I think it was against the Pistons in that last game of the season. But if you saw him in his prime, he was a guy who you honestly could say, had he worked on his defense a little bit more, could have been the equivalent of a 6'4" Michael Jordan. He was that phenomenal. And if you think I'm exaggerating about that, ask anybody that watched him play, ask his contemporaries, read about what his contemporaries said about him, read about what coaches said about him, fans who watched him and fortunate to watch him in his prime with the Denver Nuggets said about David Thompson. And just go to the man who doesn't lie. The man who will tell you whether you're a scrub or not, Michael Jeffrey Jordan. Michael Jeffrey Jordan idolized David Thompson more than anybody else. More than anybody else, even more than Walter Davis. It was David Thompson and Walter Davis who Michael Jordan patterned a lot of his game after. Remember, it was David Thompson who was on stage with Michael Jordan when Michael Jordan was inducted back in 2009. That's the respect level that he had for this guy. But unfortunately, there aren't a lot of highlights of David Thompson because, you know, the NBA wasn't really broadcast as widely back then. I think if David Thompson had played 10 to 15 years later, there'd be a lot more highlights of him. But man, some of the dunks that he did in game and against legit big men too, shot blockers, defensive players, power forwards, centers, you know what I'm saying? And the way he was able to elevate. I've said it like Julius Erving, but even more so with David Thompson, like he was climbing an invisible escalator or something. Unbelievable. And he could touch the top of the backboard. You know what I'm saying? There's always these stories about guys, what was it, jumping Jackie Jackson, I think it was, that he could snatch change from the top of the backboard. I think David Thompson said that he could touch the top of it. Like if somebody had put like a dime on the top of the backboard, he could like touch it. He couldn't snatch it, but he could touch it. But jumping Jackie Jackson, I think he was taller than David Thompson. And he might have had even higher vertical leap than David Thompson. Some of these older guys, man, I tell you, it just amazes me when I hear some of the stupidity that comes out of these younger dudes' mouths. They said everybody back then was slow and unathletic. Nah, not everybody. It was some tremendous athletes. Hell, over 100 years ago. Look up Jim Thorpe. Look up Jim Thorpe and look up some of the things that he did that still haven't been replicated as far as performance in the Olympics. This is a guy, Jim Thorpe. If I remember correctly, he had never thrown a shot put before. Never. Didn't even know what it was. Didn't have on the proper attire most people have. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the first time he threw a shot put, and I think he had on penny loafers. I think he had on suit pants, slacks, penny loafers, and a regular shirt. This guy just tried. Threw the shot put 50-some feet. Never thrown it before. Threw a javelin. I don't know what the distance is, but he threw it remarkably far. And like, you know, he couldn't really get the extension he wanted because of the clothes. There was some tremendous athletes come every generation. There's always an outlier. Jim Thorpe was that outlier. Wilt Chamberlain was his generation's outlier. You know what I mean? there's been other guys recently, Bo Jackson, Deion Sanders. These are the men who are just tremendous athletes and could contend in any era. You put Jim Thorpe in today's athletics, he would be a superstar, almost unrivaled superstar. Like I said, there's always these outliers. There's people in the 19th century that were unbelievable for the time period they grew up in. I mean, the time period they were in. So anyway, just want to do a tribute to David Thompson. Tell me what you guys think.